And I'm pleased to present Ron Bern, who is our guest facilitator today for our session. So thank you for joining us.
Good morning, everybody. I don't think I have to tell you, our speaker this morning is UF history professor Paul Ortiz. Paul is one of our all-star presenters at ILR and always welcome here by all means. Paul received his PhD in 2000 from Duke University, and he came to UF in 2008 with a dual appointment, one piece being full professor of history, and the other piece being director of the nationally known Samuel Proctor Oral History program here at UF, post that he continues to hold to this day. He's an award-winning author in his own right of many books, often dealing with various aspects of African-American experience in the South. And as those of you who heard us just talking, his latest book, 50 Years of African-American Studies at the University of Florida, will be released later this month by UF Library Press. Paul is also, on top of all of his duties at UF, he's also the current president of United Faculty of Florida at UF, which is the faculty union, a handful in itself in these turbulent times at the university. Very busy guy. One final note here I'd like to mention that you probably haven't heard. In case you'd be tempted to say, well, here's Paul Ortiz, is another one of those ivory tower guys, the professors. In the mid-'80s, Paul served in the US Army for 4 years as part of the 82nd Airborne Division and the US 7th Special Forces Group, two elite military units. And he definitely has had boots on the ground, as well as in the academic world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Ortiz, who's going to talk to us on the very interesting topic of critical race theory. All yours, Paul.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that very kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be here again. I always love coming back home to talk at OCAMIC, to be back in Gainesville after so many, Zoom sessions and maybe starting to travel again later this spring. I don't know, but my Black History Month has started early as always. And we had a wonderful session at the Harn Museum on one of my earlier books, Emancipation Betrayed. And it was so much fun, but it's just great to be able to talk to so many friends and dear colleagues. I won't start calling you out, because if I did, we'd spend the whole hour, of me telling stories about different people here. And you probably didn't come to hear stories. In other words, historians love gossip. So I'll try to keep the gossip to a minimum. But I wanted to talk, I was asked to talk about critical race theory, and there's a lot of things around critical race theory. There's a lot of terms. There's terms like intersectionality, social construction of race. And I wanted to talk about this morning about what critical race theory is and what it is not. I think the problem right now in these discussions about a critical race theory and all of these bills being passed throughout the country against critical race theory, one of the hilarious things is quite often, and you can see this on television, where an anchor or a cable news network will invite a very ardent congressperson in to talk about why they're promoting this bill against critical race theory in their respective state. And the television anchor begins by saying, well, first of all, define critical race theory for us. And there's a long pause, a long silence. And then sometimes the congressperson will put it back onto the TV news person. Well, how do you define critical race theory? And then the news person will say, well, actually, I asked you the question first. You're promoting this bill against critical race theory. what is it? Why should we be so concerned about it? And more recently, though, because the opponents of critical race theory can't really define it, because to define it would mean you got to do some reading, you got to do some research. And if you think it's hard as a teacher or a professor to get college students or high school students to do reading, try to get one of these folks who's opposed to critical race theory so ardently, try to get them to do some reading. It's interesting. I'm not saying that none of them read, but it's really interesting. So what I'm going to do today is not just talk about critical race theory, although I'll define that in the words of its founder, but I'll also talk about kind of what the hullabaloo is all about. So I wanted to start with, what is critical race theory? And I will send the presentation to Julie, so I won't read all the slides. And if you miss anything, you'll be able to kind of go through it at your leisure. But I did want to kind of read this first one because it is kind of important. Critical race theory boils down to some very kind of core ideas. It's been around for a long time. And it's interesting to think about if critical race theory, which was really created by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who I'll be talking about in a moment, if she created it 40 years ago, why did it take about 40 years for these bills against critical race theory to manifest themselves? That's a historical question. And that's one that we could all kind of work together on, because people right now are debating that. Why now? What is it about this moment that has caused this outpouring of anger against critical race theory? When you boil it down, it's a very basic concept. And when I was in graduate school at Duke, we used these terms from critical race theory, but in general, even today, critical race theory is generally primarily taught in top tier law schools. So for example, at the University of Florida, you could take a course that heavily involves critical race theory in law, because it's used heavily in law. It's been used heavily in cases, especially discrimination cases. If you went to Harvard, if you went to Bolt Hall, if you went to, again, the top law schools in the country, you might take a course that's inflected by critical race theory. But if you're a K through 12 student in Florida or California, it's very rare, if any time at all, that you would be exposed to critical race theory, because it is a very theoretical framework. But it's essentially, it seems basic, but as you can see, even with this basic introduction, there's going to be some controversies. And let me start by saying that, I'll read this. Challenging racism means much more than changing individual hearts and minds. It means examining institutions, including education, corporations, laws, entertainment, et cetera, to find the structural causes of inequality that can be rooted out. And so Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who's really the founder and really the intellectual force behind critical race theory, was involved in a number of lawsuits in the 1970s and 80s involving African-American women in the private sector. And she had to explain to the courts that the discrimination that Black women were facing in employment had to do not just with their race, but also because of their gender. And so think about this term I'm going to introduce in a moment called intersectionality. Intersectionality means we have to think in a little more sophisticated way about how racism works. And most commonly, intersectionality means connecting racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, different homophobia, and different forms of discrimination together. That's kind of what intersectionality means, and intersectionality is a really important part of critical race theory. But keep in mind that this is more than just thinking about racism as an individual problem. It means looking at the law, looking at the schools, looking at institutions like corporations, like say Hollywood, for example. Is Hollywood truly race neutral? Are there racial stereotypes? Are there anti-Semitic stereotypes still being promoted in Hollywood or in literature? And if so, why? What can we do to challenge those or to root those out? So the other aspect of critical race theory, as you can tell by now, is it's a very active kind of theory. It says, well, now that you've identified the fact that race is a problem in this institution, say a corporation, what are you going to do about it? It's really an implicit and sometimes explicit call to action. I mentioned Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, brilliant law professor at Columbia, not the only critical race theorist. Professor Derek Bell, who many of you know is at Harvard Law School for years. He actually resigned because of the lack of faculty of color at Harvard. He passed away a few years ago. He was another kind of titan in the development of the idea of critical race theory. But really, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is really at the forefront. And you can see right away, and I'm not going to read her vita, but her work in drawing attention to the issue of police violence against Black women and girls, you can see that where her passion is in trying to root out racism in institutions, in the sense in schools and in policing. And right there, it's going to make her work controversial in our society, if you think about how our society is organized. But again, no laws, to my knowledge, against critical race theory were passed until quite recently. And Kimberly Crenshaw has been working on this theory for years and years. Like I said, I learned about critical race theory when I was a graduate student at Duke. And that was, Ron, that was like 50 years ago, right? No, it was in the 90s. So it's been around for a while. Now, intersectionality, which is really at the center of critical race theory, I think is controversial because it's really a demanding kind of theory. It says you can't just look at racism or sexism in isolation. You got to combine them. You got to put them together. You can't just think about racism without thinking about its connection to anti-Semitism or to homophobia. And I'm going to give us some examples in a moment of how you can employ intersectionality, and all of us have already done that, by the way. This is not going to be anything new, I don't think, for most of us. And again, I won't read the center quote, but Professor Crenshaw talks about how her understanding and her development of critical race theory, this is not as abstract as it sounds, because she uses the idea in her approach to employment discrimination at first in the late 70s, and then on other problems such as what we call the school to prison pipeline. That is, why do so many students in certain schools end up in juvenile detention, or end up getting suspended, or end up in being incarcerated as children? And that's what we call the school to prison pipeline. And so Professor Crenshaw works with a number of different people, both within law and in other areas. We have a lot of faculty, for example, at UF who work on this problem. How do we make schools and not pipelines to send working class youth to prisons? How can we use intersectionality? And right away, my first thought when I was learning this theory was the ways in which the great scholars of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust thought in the 1950s. And of course, Hannah Arendt was the foremost of those. And those of you who were veterans of the talk I gave on Joseph Conrad, his magnificent novel, Heart of Darkness, several years ago at Okamek will remember Hannah Arendt. She was a person who was really interested and intrigued by Joseph Conrad's explorations, his story, his experiences in the Belgian Congo, his unearthing, and the way he presented genocide in the Heart of Darkness. And so she used the Heart of Darkness in her research into the origins of the Nazi Holocaust. And she doesn't use the term intersectionality, but this is really what she's doing, because she understands that the origins of European, she says, you know, look, anti-Semitism is an integral part of European civilization. And by the way, in Europe, they don't use the term Western civilization. That's kind of an American hangup. But she says, look, anti-Semitism has been an integral part of European civilization from the outset. However, why did it become so murderous in the modern era? Because the Holocaust happens in the 1930s, it doesn't happen in the 1630s, although there are anti-Jewish pogroms. But why was this one so bloody? Why was this one so extensive? Why did this one involve the mobilization of the most powerful industrial nation on the continent to kill Jewish people? And she says it's racism, it's colonialism. And if you haven't had the chance to read Origins of Totalitarianism, please do so. I would love to, if you ever have a book club about that book, Shirley, let me know. Because I love to be able to sit in and to talk about the book. I first read the book in college. It was a revelation, because what Professor Arendt says is that the Europeans should have known better. When they went to Africa, when they went to Latin America, when they went to Asia, and they imposed these ideas of racial superiority and racial inferiority, how long did they think it would take for the chickens to come home to roost? And that's really what the entire first half of Origins of Totalitarianism is all about. So let me go back a couple of years to a kinder, gentler, more hopeful moment in Florida educational history. This was a piece of legislation and an update to our educational code that I actually had the great privilege to work on. And those of you familiar with my earlier work know that I've written extensively about the African-American freedom struggle in Florida, the 1920 Ocoee Election Day riots, when an entire community mobilized to try to register, to try to vote, and was wiped out. White vigilantes poured into Western Orange County, laid siege to the town of Ocoee, killed, murdered, beat people, drove people out. And Ocoee became an all-white town. It became a sundown town. And by the way, the property that Black farmers lost, and many of them just lost it outright, or they had to sell it for very low prices to very wealthy white plantation owners. That property now is valued at $10 million in current dollars. But I worked with Senator Bracey's team, legislative team, as they put together the bill about remembering the Ocoee massacre. And this bill, or this new update to the education code in Florida 2 years ago, now requires all school districts in the state of Florida to offer content about the Ocoee massacre. Now, there's a problem, though, because it's an unfunded mandate. And then the other problem about this is that teachers don't go to college learning about the Ocoee massacre in high school or in college in most cases. So this bill, this law has kept me working, and many scholars across the state that do Black history in Florida kept us working overtime because the state didn't provide any resources to really make this a reality. But it's an important step forward. But I'm bringing this up because I want to also connect this to, as you'll see here, Holocaust Education Week. And what this is doing, what this educational bill 2 years ago is doing, is it's trying to amplify education about African-American history, in this case, the Ocoee massacre, but also amplify education about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. So that's 2 years ago. So here's now. This is the bill, or this is the education rule that's really at the core of the current anti-critical race theory bill which is we're dealing with in the state legislature now. And you'll see a lot of similarities between these bills from state to state to state, which is interesting in itself, because you can see this is a national movement. And I won't read all of this education rule, but what the rule did was it immediately banned the teaching of critical race theory in Florida's K through 12 schools. But it was, what's that phrase they say? It was a problem searching, it was a solution searching for problems or something like that. Because again, critical race theory was not being taught in any K through 12 school that I know of, that I'm aware of. And I have several former students who are teachers in Florida schools. And I actually called them last spring. I said, does anyone in your school, in your school district in South Florida teach critical race theory in middle school or high school? And they're like, no, we have no idea. You know, when you assigned it to us in college, it took us all, you know, it took us a whole week to read one book. So we're not going to have our 9th grade social studies class learn critical race theory. But check it out here. If you look at the bill or the rule, it's really, I think it's insidious, because on the one hand, it's saying study about the Holocaust, study slavery, study the Civil War and Reconstruction, Hispanic history. That's all good. But what is insidious about this is that it implicitly connects the teaching of critical race theory to anti-Semitism. It implicitly connects the teaching of the 1619 curriculum, which is created by Nicole Hannah-Jones and her scholarly collaborators, teaching us a new way to look at US history. But what's the problem? What's the problem that the state of Florida has with critical race theory or the 1619 project? It's in this clause: may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. Okay, that's a very interesting statement. Instruction must include the US Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and subsequent amendments. Okay, we already do that. And so a lot of these things are already done. Well, let's break down that statement about may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. That's the thought police right there. And for me as a historian, that's a big problem, because in the scholarly world, in the history world, even among most of the historians who don't use critical race theory, and that's about 99% of us, that clause right there is up for debate. Because whatever you think about the United States now, the idea that it was founded as a nation based largely on universal principles is a scholarly debate that takes place on elite American university campuses. Again, Harvard, Princeton, UF, all the schools that we aspire to are essentially debating this idea. Let me elaborate a little further. So if you look back, let me go back to the rule for a minute. The idea that racism is an individual thing. It's not embedded in any American institution. That's really the crux of the law against anti-critical race theory. But the problem is it's wrong, because racism has been embedded in American institutions, and not just in this country. When I teach about slavery, I don't just teach about slavery in the US, because Brazil had a larger slave system. Mexico had a huge slave system. The Dutch East Indies, the French West Indies, the British Caribbean. When we teach about slavery now, we teach about empires. And the idea that slavery was an individual choice and not a system is really absurd. But to understand events like the Holocaust, like the Ikoyi massacre, slavery, I argue that we must understand that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems, and that this nation was not originally founded on universal principles. That idea may be in the abstract, but if you sat down with Thomas Jefferson and you said that Black people were equal to white people, you know what his response is. You don't have to be a historian to know what his response is. His response is no, they are not. If you ask Thomas Jefferson, are Native Americans, should they be subjected to the same exact laws because they're equal to Europeans, he would have said, well, no, absolutely not. That's absurd. And if you'd asked the question to the mainstream founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, they would have given you the same answer. Now, if you asked Thomas Paine, you would have got a very different answer, right? But see, what that's pointing to is this idea of a nation founded on universal principles from the very beginning is an argument, a vicious dispute, if you will, that in some ways culminates in the American Civil War, one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. But it's not something we can take for granted. I couldn't in good conscience, if I was a K through 12 teacher or a university professor, stand in front of my courses and lie to them and say, oh, yeah, everyone was equal when we first started out. Isn't that great? Because that would be robbing their ancestors, my ancestors, of all the hard work they did to get closer to universal principles. And what do I mean about this? It took generations of struggle for us to bring women in the society closer to the idea of universality, of universal principles of human rights for women and men. But women had to fight for those rights. And I'm showing, some of you have seen Helena Hill Weeds. This is an iconic photo from the American suffrage movement. Many women were imprisoned. Some women were tortured. And I show some of the transcripts of some of the trials of suffragettes to my students, and they're shocked. They're like, wow, the police, are they waterboarding these women? I'm like, that's essentially what they were doing, because the suffragettes were seen by many men who ran American society in the early 20th century as terrorists, as saboteurs, as people trying to undermine the American way of life, which had no place for women voting. Women had to fight for the right to vote. It wasn't something granted to them. And I think this is unfortunately, I have to say, one of the goals of the people passing these bills against critical race theory is they don't really want us to know how we fight for the idea of universal human rights for all, that these rights are not just granted to us by the state. And when you defend that kind of mindset that your rights and my rights were just given to us by the state, what kind of ideology is that? I would call that authoritarianism, pure and simple. You may have been, if you've been following the news recently, you know that my friend and dear colleague, J. Michael Butler, the author of this wonderful book, Beyond Integration. I actually read the manuscript. I wrote a book blurb for it. He goes to give a teacher's workshop in Osceola County last week, and he was canceled because there were people in the school district in Osceola who were concerned that J. Michael Butler was a scholar of critical race theory. Well, he is not. He's a professor of history, a very distinguished professor of history at Flagler College. And the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program has hosted Mike to campus for a book talk and a book signing. Some of you may have attended that. He's a wonderful gentleman. But basically, this is what's happening now in Florida. If you're under suspicion of teaching critical race theory, which its opponents don't even know what it is, then this is what is beginning to happen on the ground. This is what I call authoritarianism. This is not a debate. This is not allowing Mike to get up and talk and defend his ideas and his scholarly research. Oh, and by the way, it took him 10 years to write this book. It was really a labor of love. But we're just going to cancel him because, oh, well, he may say something that makes us feel bad. Let me move to that now, because because the opponents of critical race theory have not been able to define it in any meaningful way, because they're generally too lazy to read it and study it, they've made up stuff. And so what they've made up, and this is with my book and with many others, my book, African American Latinx History of the United States, which we did an event, I think 2 years ago, Shirley. I did a book signing and a little more than that when that book came out. Now notice there's a moving kind of target. And so like my book, for example, African American Latinx History of the United States, doesn't really employ critical race theory explicitly. I talk about intersectionality a little bit, but now states are beginning to pass laws against books that they think might make some people feel uneasy. I want us to think about that for a moment. States are beginning to pass laws and school districts are beginning to ban books that they think might make people feel uneasy. That's where we're at now. And the good side of this story is that if not the adults, the children are beginning to fight back. Let me tell you a story that was shared with by one of my former students yesterday. She actually messaged me and said that in her school district, and I can't reveal her identity because it's very obviously a sensitive topic. She said in her school district in South Florida, a very powerful parents group had approached the superintendent of the schools and was able to get the school district to remove Toni Morrison's novels from school libraries, because those novels, this parents group said, made white people feel bad about themselves. And so they shouldn't be read. Okay. Now, there wasn't a ban, but this is how books are usually banned in the US. It's very rare. Our federal government doesn't ban books. What usually happens is school districts pull books off shelves, right? We all kind of know that. So anyway, the school district kind of quietly did that because they didn't want to make a big row over it. But guess what happened? About 2 weeks later, when the students discovered that this had happened, a group of freshman girls got together and created their own Toni Morrison book club. And so they're reading a Toni Morrison novel every month for the rest of the academic year. The parents group found out about this and they went back to the superintendent and they said, you got to stop this from happening. These girls are violating the spirit of this thing. And the superintendent said, well, I'm sorry, but I can't, I can take books off of a shelf in a library, in a school library, but what these girls do in their own time is their own business. But it's interesting that the parents group even tries to control the thought process of girls and boys and students during school and even after school. That is troublesome to me. The other thing that's really troublesome is if you think about Kimberly Crenshaw, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Toni Morrison, why are their books, why is their work the subject of these incredibly energetic book banning, rules against CRT, take the books off the shelf, attack the 1619 curriculum? Sure, every writer has flaws. If you read any of my works, I want you to tell me, when you have disagreements with them. And we've done that in our sessions. And when we talk about people, it doesn't matter if it's Toni Morrison or William Faulkner or Conrad, or when we had our wonderful session on Mark Twain a few years ago, we've talked about the strengths of those works, but also the flaws. We've talked about Mark Twain, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is maybe the greatest novel, the American novel, but with a lousy ending. The ending is so bad, and scholars for generations have been trying to explain the ending of that book because the rest of the novel is so magnificent. But think about, why this moment are so many powerful interests trying to ban books written by Black women. I think that's really an important question that needs to be addressed in a much larger sense. So kind of starting to wind up here and getting back to the Florida law, the educational rule about forcing us to focus on universal principles that this country was supposedly founded on. It's really problematic because it doesn't match up to the historical evidence. The historical evidence tells us that over the decades and generations, yes, your ancestors, my ancestors fought for equality, for civil rights, for women's rights, for LGBT rights, but those rights don't exist at the outset of the formation of the Republic. If you look at this sign, this is this Jim Crow sign that my father grew up with in Houston, Texas. No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. That's not an example of universal principles. Or the Okaloosa News Journal, an editorial that they wrote, which I featured in my book, Emancipation Betrayed, the same editorial that ran, by the way, in the Miami Herald, the Pensacola Commercial, the Florida Times-Union, the Gainesville Sun, this idea of upholding white supremacy. And October 29th is significant as a date because that's the eve of the election, of the presidential election. And so Florida's newspaper syndicates wanted us to remember this is not a nation based on universal principles. This is a nation based upon white male supremacy. And the only way we broke that down was movement organizing, was struggle, right? But not originally a nation built upon universal principles. Don't go to the great industrialists of the Gilded Age or the 19th century and tell them the US was based upon universal principles, because if you're familiar with US history, you know that even the debate over the right to vote was fraught, and it still has not concluded. And people like Charles Francis Adams, grandson and son of American presidents, doesn't buy it. Doesn't buy even the premise of universal suffrage, does not buy it. Because for him, it would mean a Celtic, an African, a Chinese proletariat that had the same rights as I do, Charles Francis Adams. And I don't want to live in that society. That's essentially what he's saying. Andrew Carnegie did not believe in universal principles. He was an outspoken opponent of the right to vote of African Americans. You might ask yourself, why would Andrew Carnegie care about the right of African Americans to vote in a state like Florida? Well, white supremacists in Florida loved Andrew Carnegie because they could always pull out this quote to say, with all due respect to our friends up north, the most important person of the age is an opponent of Negro suffrage. End of argument. But again, I'm not doing this to pick on Andrew Carnegie. I'm just pointing out that the idea of universality, of universal human rights, of equality, and et cetera, is not something that's widely accepted by the people that run the society for most of the existence of this republic. And it's not even clear now, if you look at voter suppression laws across the country, that universal universal rights have been accepted. Those of you who were at, I think, the last book talk that I gave at OCAMIC, which we had so much fun, will know the answer to this question: which noted writer did not depict the US as a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence in 1842? And of course, it's Charles Dickens. And Dickens writes about this in American Notes during his tour of the United States. He was horrified because he came to the US with this idea. He wanted to believe the US was the freest nation on earth, and he discovered it just wasn't true. And he writes about that in American Notes. And we had a great journey talking about American Notes. And also, I think we also talked about Great Expectations as well, which is one of my favorite novels. And Great Expectations was shaped in big part by Dickens's journeys in the United States. It isn't like he hated our country. He loved the United States, but he was shocked and appalled by the inequalities and the level of oppression he saw against Native Americans, against African Americans. And here he writes extensively, and you can read this at your leisure. Again, I'll give this to Julie and Ron, the lecture. But here, Charles Dickens is referring to what we call, or what was called then, the gag rule, which is a rule which forbade US congressmen, and they're all men back then, it forbade US congressmen from even bringing up and introducing anti-slavery petitions in Congress at the penalty of of imprisonment, believe it or not. You couldn't even talk about slavery because of this gag rule. You could expand it, but you couldn't talk about it. And Dickens was really appalled by that fact. But again, not bringing this up to just dig up dirt, but just to point out, ending slavery was a struggle in this country. It wasn't something that basically we were born with. It wasn't inevitable that slavery would end. And this gets us back to Frederick Douglass, and I've shared this in other contexts with you, but the idea that opponents of critical race theory want us they don't want us to look at racism or anti-Semitism or sexism within institutions. They want us to see all of these forms of oppression they want us to understand them to be caused by individual choice. But that's just not how history works. History works on institutions, armies, corporations, schools. Individual choice, yes, important. But individuals didn't choose to secede from the Union. That was entire states, that was entire institutions that made those choices. Individuals didn't choose to invade Mexico in the 1840s in order to reimpose slavery in Mexico. That was an entire nation that did that. And by the way, probably the majority of Americans were opposed to the US invasion of Mexico, as far as we can tell now, but that didn't stop the US from engaging in that activity in support of slavery. But this just gets back to the idea that to understand inequality, to understand racism, we can't just see it as an individual bias the way that the opponents of critical race theory want us to see it as. When I talk about the Ocoee massacre, I don't talk about it as, again, the work of isolated individuals or individual choice. I talk about it as a systemic part of US history and US institutions that we've had to work so hard, our ancestors had to work so hard to root out, to challenge. This list of anti-Black pogroms, this is just a partial list. And this was something that was part and parcel of American political culture for decades in this country. And it's only something that we've been able to challenge collectively. And I think that gets us, really, kind of starting to wrap up here. The main problem about these rules against critical race theory is it's not even that they attack critical race theory, because as I've said before, in most cases, critical race theory is not being taught in K-12 schools. But what we're trying to teach our students is how to identify oppression, how to challenge it. And sometimes that's upsetting. And I remember when I was in high school, my high school AP teacher, English, the only AP class I ever took, he had us read Richard Wright's Native Son, magnificent novel about African-American life and racism in Chicago. Was the book upsetting? Yeah, it was really upsetting to read that book, because I began connecting the experiences of Bigger Thomas with the experience of kids of color like myself, who grew up in a really gritty shipyard town in the 1970s in Bremerton, Washington. Was reading Sylvia Plath, Bell Jar, upsetting? Yes. What a shocking, disturbing novel. Was reading Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five upsetting? Yes, it really was upsetting to me, because I grew up in a milieu where people had been psychically traumatized by World War II. And that's what Slaughterhouse-Five is about. And it's about the refusal of our society to be sympathetic and to deal with that trauma. And so did that book upset me? Yeah, it did. But see, that's what great literature, that's what cutting edge thought is supposed to do. I hope that I know that you do this at ILR, right? You talk about really provocative, cutting edge ideas. But wrapping up here, again, I want to get us kind of end where we started with the idea of intersectionality. And so Professor Hannah Arendt is again trying to get us to understand the connections between racism and anti-Semitism. And when you think about the Holocaust, this is why I am opposed to these anti-critical race theory rules and bills, because they pretend to say that, you know, study slavery, study the Holocaust, but they take away the tools that we would need to really understand those things. And to understand slavery, colonialism, the Holocaust in the modern era, you have to consider intersectionality. You have to consider how these things are connected. So the Nazis in the early 1930s, and this is not controversial whatsoever, come to the United States, study race laws in the US, bring them back to Germany, and they formulate the Nuremberg race laws based in part on American race laws. Okay, that's not, again, a nation based upon universal principles. But this is why we have to study the Holocaust. In some ways, I think when we study the Holocaust, when we study slavery, when we study sexism or any form of oppression, we're asking ourselves to put a mirror and to kind of look at that mirror. What role do I play in perpetuating anti-Semitism? What role do I play in perpetuating sexism? What can I do about these forms of oppression? And I think ultimately this is what the proponents of critical race theory are trying to kind of short circuit and stop. They apparently don't want us to get to the root of these forms of oppression because they're taking away our ability to look at systems of oppression. The Holocaust was a system. It was a bureaucratic system. It wasn't just individual Germans making choices. That happened too, but it was entire institutions. It was the German military, the SS, the bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll just kind of fast forward through this connection between US race laws. Adolf Hitler admired the US not for democracy, but he admired the US because, as he said it, the US wiped out its native occupants. And when Hitler looked at the US relationship to Native Americans, he just transposed it to Jews and Russians. And he said, we're going to do to Jews and Russians what the Americans did to the red peoples, as he called them. He loved Westerns, by the way. He was an avid watcher of Hollywood Westerns. This is an example of what teachers and professors are having to put up with now. I didn't teach a course on critical race theory in the fall, but I kept getting emails from this so-called grassroots group called Campus Reform, asking me to make statements about critical race theory. And I looked into Campus Reform, and it's funded by the Koch network. And the Koch network has been involved in the writing of these laws against critical race theory. So when you hear that these parents groups are grassroots social movements, that's not true. They're funded from a very wealthy funder. They also, the Florida Citizens Alliance, which is one of the forces behind the attempt to ban critical race theory in Florida, again, advocates the banning of Toni Morrison novels, advocates a whole range of books. I just thought Frank Court's Angela's Ashes is interesting because it's such an amazing book, but also advocates the banning of Pearson's Essentials of Oceanography. Why? Because it talks about global climate change. And again, this is an authoritarian move. They don't want us to have these debates about these critical issues that we really should be thinking about, okay? But I just want to let you know, these are the types of messages that faculty here are getting on a pretty frequent basis. And essentially they're trying to bait us. They're trying to get us to respond. And if we respond, then we'll end up in, some kind of right-wing, kind of blog. And I'll give Professor Arendt the last word, because I think what she says in 1950, after the end of World War II, we should apply to ourselves as well. This is, again, a look. This is Hannah Arendt's look. She's like, Europeans, look in the mirror moment. And I think we're at a moment where we begin to look at the mirror the Black Lives Matter movement helped us do that. And by the way, I really think that the anti-critical race theory movement is really aimed more at the Black Lives Matter movement. But because the Black Lives Matter movement is so popular, these people who are trying to pass these laws against critical race theory said, well, we're not going to attack Black Lives Matter head on, so let's attack this obscure legal theory. But what Hannah Arendt says, the subterranean stream of Western history has finally come to the surface and usurped the dignity of our tradition. All she's saying is we got to look at ourselves. What is it that we do to, how do we contribute? How did European civilization, contribute to the coming of the Holocaust? And how can we make sure in the future nothing like that ever happens again? So I think I went over my time as always, and so I'll stop now. Thank you for being such a great audience, and I'll be happy to take questions or comments.
Thanks, Paul. Folks, let's open it up for questions and comments. Put your hands up and we'll get started. Paul, I had one thing, just an observation. The term critical race theory, do you think it's unfortunate that we have to use the word theory to indicate that it's something that is, well, it implies something obscure, something that it might apply to the theories of Darwin, for example, that sort of thing. Don't you think it puts us on the defensive almost immediately?
Yeah, Ron, that's an interesting question. And yeah, I mean, if you think about the original iteration of critical race theory, it wasn't necessarily meant to be something broadly used. It was something that grows up in the context of court cases, again, originally involving employment discrimination. And if you're an avid reader of employment discrimination in court cases, which I think most of us probably aren't, right? Yeah, it's a very, it's a challenging theory in the sense it was never meant to be a popular kind of theory. And I remember when I was in college learning, the theory of natural selection, for example, I had kind of, some of the same thoughts. I'm like, oh my God, this is a great, powerful idea, but it wasn't something necessarily designed to, be understood implicitly or very easily. It's something you had to study. And that's part of the reason, Ron, why, again, critical race theory is very rarely, if ever, taught in any K-12 school throughout this country. Is it really takes, it's really like more of a grad seminar kind of thing. Like if ILR said, hey, let's do a course in critical race theory, it would be a full term of talking about the theory, its origins, its applications, its interlocutors, its the debates. So yeah, it's definitely not something. So I'm glad you pointed that out, though, because what makes it hard to define is also kind of what it makes it hard to defend. If you're asking me, and I think that's the reason, that's the genius of the attacks on it, if you will, is that why would I spend my time defending a theory when there's so many other political battles to fight, like voter suppression, for example, like LGBT rights, like anti-Semitism. I mean, those are the types of things that we have to spend time fighting. And the idea that we're going to have to defend a theory seems to ask us to do even more than we're already doing. Now, I don't know who is next because there's a lot of folks. I see, Shirley, you have your hand up.
Shirley was next.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Julie. You're keeping track. Thank you. Thank you, Julie.
Hi, Paul. I love it. Somehow or other you speak to my core and it really gets to me. I thank you so much. But I want to ask you, where are we today? Don't you see particularly white male supremacy? Are we coming to a peak here? how do you get your mind around January 6th and where we're going with this now? What do you think about that? Bring us up to speed with your depth of thinking about it.
Well, Shirley, I wrote a piece with Susan Hageman from our Department of English about the Richard Spencer visit to UF. And as many of you know, I was a vocal opponent of that. I mean, our argument was that, neo-Nazism has no place in our community. And, you can debate, you can study the rise of Nazi Germany. You can take a course with Professor Norm Goda, who's one of the outstanding Holocaust historians in this country. And that's great. And you should take that course. I wish I could take that course, maybe when I'm on sabbatical next. But the idea that you would allow people with torches to march up and down our residential neighborhoods where I live, many of you know my wife, Sheila, we live on 7th Lane. When the Richard Spencer people were talking about coming to Gainesville, and many of us remember this several years ago, they weren't talking about just being at UF with Richard Spencer. They wanted to march through our neighborhoods. And our community took a strong stance against that. And a number of us approached these neo-Nazi individuals and said, you're not marching down our neighborhoods. So we were criticized, some of us. Well, Paul, and in fact, people called me. And some of my colleagues said, Paul, I'm surprised at you. This is about Richard Spencer has as much right to be in Gainesville as anyone else. I'm like, yeah, but his people don't have the right to march through our neighborhoods. That's not going to happen. And some people said, well, that was an example of white male supremacy. Yes, but also we have to qualify that because obviously it's only a certain group of white men. Why do they act like this? There's also women involved in the movement. There's also some Hispanics involved in the movement as well. And so why are they drawn to this kind of authoritarian ideology at this point? Right now, the thing I'm worried about, and see, if you're worried about, dangerous ideas proliferating in this country, to me, the big worry, and I talk about this in my piece about Richard Spencer, and Susan and I talked about this, almost 10% of people in the US, when they're polled, believe that Nazism is an acceptable political ideology. I mean, the whole thing. And they've done this poll over and over again, and it trends from 8 to 10 or 8 to 11%. And I'm like, that's the warning bell. And the other warning bell is these bans on books, these bans on thinking, these attempts to stop faculty, not just here at the University of Florida, but other institutions, to stop them from talking about voting rights, to stop us from talking about pandemic safety measures, the academic freedom struggle that we're having right now at the UF, that many of you have been very supportive of intellectual freedom. I think this kind of ties together. So I don't want to just say it's white male supremacy, surely, although I think that's a part of it, certainly. I can't, as a union president, I can't say that UF is the bastion of white male supremacy, because there's other things going on, if you kind of catch my drift.
No, I really was talking about January 6th and where the country is going.
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. I mean, and to me, the troubling thing there, Shirley, too, is our failure of political categories. And what I mean by that is that January 6th, and Ron mentioned my experiences in Central America, in Latin American terms, that's what we call an autogolpe, a self-coup, an attempt by a person who had been voted out of office to try to stay in office. And that's clear, that should be clear, but tens of millions of people don't believe that even happened now. And some of them even believe that January 6th was some kind of documentary film. I read recently. So yeah, there's something really bad going on there that we've got to pay more attention to. We can't let that go. Definitely, we got to keep our attention on that.
Thank you, Paul. I'm not sure how much time you have for us, but there are a few more questions.
Oh yeah, please. I got plenty of time. I don't have any. My next meeting's not till 11:30.
Okay, so in chat, the next question was, please comment on the book Cast.
Isabel Wilkers, yeah, Friedman. Yeah, Isabel is an incredible author, and her book Warmth of Warmth of Other Suns is her first big book, is a tremendous book about the Black freedom struggle. There's an incredible sequence about a young African-American man who flees Florida to find freedom. Caste is a book that, it's another big book, and it's I think there's many good aspects of the book. I disagree with the idea that race relations in the US are also caste relations. I think they're more fluid. I'm not trying to downplay US race relations, because I think that, if you're familiar with my work, you know that I try to give people a very kind of nuanced, but also, kind of blunt understanding of those. But that's my question with caste. And again, I think most of the scholarly apparatus is sound of the book, but I just I don't see US race relations and caste relations in India as being exactly, kind of parallel. It's not exactly what she's arguing, but that's kind of my take on the book. It's a book well worth reading. And I've had that's a book I have my graduate students certainly read. That's one of the books I think you have to read now to really be up to date on theories of race and inequality.
Right. Abe Goldman, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. And thank you very much for inviting us, including those of us who are not at OCAMIC at the moment, at least. But Paul, I really appreciate your talk, which is great, and all of your other work, including with UFF. But, and this is not but, and I'm trying to deal with my and, virtually all of my friends and colleagues' deep sense of disquiet about, some of the things that you've mentioned and that we see going on. And one of them is and I guess I could use the term intersectionality between tactics and strategies at political levels. And when you mentioned, for example, the onslaught on the Board of Education down in South Florida about, the books on shelves, and then that kind of taken up or perhaps inspired by legislative action or attempted action, to ban books or to empower, individual parents to be able to ban books and to control the curriculum in schools. I mean, we have this apparently evolving set of tactics of mob rule, of relatively, and often many cases, small numbers of very loud proponents of shutting down or restricting a whole range of activities, including attacking election officials and others, which I think is evolving, or perhaps even was meant to become a strategy of taking control of our elections, of our schools, of our, a whole range of other institutions, and using mob rule or mob, apparent outrage as a tactic in order to achieve that larger strategic aim. It's hard to get people to want to run for school board anymore, or, including the recent attempt by the legislature to remove, to make those unpaid positions and to restrict who can even run. It is so deeply disquieting. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to respond to these kinds of tactics, as well as at the higher level, the strategies.
Yeah, well, I think there's some good news here too. Abe, you may think I'm an eternal optimist, but it gets back to what Shirley was saying earlier about the importance of January 6th. I mean, January 6th witnessed a coup attempt. There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind about that. The planners were incompetence, and that was really the thing that may have saved us from something much worse than what happened, which was bad enough. But the good news, though, is that I see this anti-critical critical race theory movement, if you want to call it a movement, I see these attacks on intellectual freedom as themselves a backlash to something that's fundamentally happening in the society, which is we're beginning to connect the dots. If you think about intersectionality with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's caused this really kind of awakening in the society. As a historian, I see this. It's interesting that this happens during the global pandemic. My Hispanic Heritage Month and my Black History Month literally blew up after Black Lives Matter. I had 3 times as many Hispanic Heritage Month lectures across the country after the Black Lives Matter movement kind of reemerged in the spring of 2020. I think because that movement really pushed us from all walks of life to get back to the mirror and to say, you know, what am I doing? What is my society doing? Maybe I took these things for granted. And then January 6th is another one of those wake-up calls. And the good news is that people are concerned. You know, I know people here, many of you here have fought for academic freedom for generations. This is why I think initially a lot of people expected the faculty you have to kind of fold back in October. And they're like, well, you know, the administration, the board of trustees, the governor, they're too powerful. But the reason we didn't fold was that because of the people here, because you all know what it took to establish the modicum of academic freedom that we enjoy at the University of Florida and institutions in the South. UF wasn't created on the idea of academic freedom. It was an all-white male and Protestant institution and very anti-Semitic to the core. And if you want to challenge me, test me on that, just go back and look at what Sam Proctor and his experiences at the University of Florida in the 1940s and 1950s. He could talk about anti-Semitism at this institution. But see, he fought against that. Sam was one of just like 3 or 4 faculty members. We came across this one day a few years ago to sign a statement supporting integration in the city of Gainesville in the early 60s. My gosh, what courage. One of 3 or 4 faculty in the entire university to support integration in the city of Gainesville. And this is what I mean by the reason that we're standing firm in support of intellectual freedom now, because we understand this is something we didn't earn. It was something that previous generations fought, were harassed. We have the Johns Committee history. Many of you familiar with that unfortunate episode in the history of Florida. Faculty being fired because they're suspected of being lesbian or gay. Faculty in the 60s fired because they supported Dr. King, the St. Augustine movement. And so, no, we're not going to let go of this struggle. And that's our strength, Abe, I think is our common history. You know, even though we debate and we argue with each other over 100 myriad topics, we understand where we've come from. And, I'm a first generation college student, and I understand that the door was opened to me by the civil rights movement, by African Americans who fought and sacrificed and sometimes, yes, even died in states like Mississippi and Florida. They're the ones that opened the door to higher education for people like me, because that opportunity did not exist before the 1960s. You know, when UF became an international institution, much more welcoming to people from all walks of life, it's the civil rights movement that really opens that door for the rest of us. So that's my hope, is that as long as we remember where we came from and what we had to do to come together, even at this meeting right now, then we're going to be okay. There's going to be a lot of challenges. There's going to be, but we do have to remember, Abe, I think that we are in a crisis moment. And it isn't just the, it's not I don't think it's a rural urban thing. I don't even think it's necessarily a left-right thing. I think it's just that we're fighting a kind of authoritarianism, which, as Shirley mentioned, is manifest in January 6th. I think it was very much manifest with the Richard Spencer movement. But the good news there was that we defeated Richard Spencer. I mean, check this out. A week or two after he was in Gainesville, he gets up on television, and this is a man who loves publicity. He lives for the television. He lives for the CNN interview. But a week or two after he came to our city and we had that community-wide mobilization, what did he say? He said, you know, I've had it with the college lectures circuit. It's not fun anymore. That's what he said. And we retired him. And of course, now he's in disgrace, even among his own people. I could go on about that forever. I'll kind of stop. But it's the mass mobilization we had during the Spencer visit. Now, not everyone has to be in the streets because there are different roles for different people. I know a lot of my students were out there in the streets, and I was writing at that time, and Susan Hageman, and a lot of us were in different kind of mentor roles. But there's a room for everyone in the struggle, and that, I guess that's my call to action, is don't be depressed at this moment. Get active. Really, we need people to be active, and that could be anything from going to your local school board and saying, hey, there's a mandate to teach about the Holocaust, about African American history, about Hispanic history. Do you need help? I can put you in contact with some resources. Now, here it means putting old Ortiz to work again, right? But there's other people too that can do that work. The Carolyn Parker story, where we were able to change the name of elementary school that had been named after a Confederate general for 80 years. And let me editorialize here. J.J. Finley was not a good person. His own fellow white Confederates had really a lot of problems with him. That's a whole other lecture, by the way. But we were able to come together in spite of our disagreements to say, hey, let's name that school after an African-American woman scientist who taught in Gainesville, who can be a role model for young people, especially women, to think about becoming scientists. So I could go on and on. It's a danger giving a mic to a history professor because we just ramble on.
A couple more chat questions that I think you touched on. Are the debates largely regional, more impassioned in certain parts of the U.S.? And what's the best way to cope with the opposers of CRT?
Well, the best way is to encourage people to read and to think, to talk, to argue. They're trying to shut down these debates. They're trying to stop us from reading certain books. And here's a little secret I learned as a teacher many years ago. I mentioned Richard Wright's Native Son, Sylvia Plath's Bell Jar, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. Do you know how my English AP teacher tricked us high school kids from a shipyard town into reading those books? Do you know how he did that? It was a brilliant pedagogical tool. He told us that, hey, kids, you're not going to find these books in our school library. You're not going to find them in the downtown Bremerton library. They have salacious writing in them, and they're controversial, and some of them are banned. And man, when he said, I was a C plus student, probably not with the plus. And the day that Don Bidwell told me that, I was on the first ferry to Seattle, which was a 60-minute boat ride to Seattle bookstores to pick up those books. I still have every one of those books to this day. And every time I get the chance to, any one of us who go back to Bremerton, we take Don Bidwell out for Father's Day or take him out for lunch or dinner and just thank him. Wow, thank you, Mr. Bidwell, for shaking us up, for disturbing us. And it was a great tactic. I've used that tactic with my own students, by the way, and it still works. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that the best way to cope with people who oppose CRT, just pick up a little bit. I mean, the lecture that I gave today, I mean, that's essentially the essence of critical race theory. And so when someone brings it up as this terrible thing, just kind of respond to them. Well, no, it isn't such a terrible thing. Let's talk about this. I think encouraging people to read, encouraging people to be passionate about education is a really good thing, you know, and get organized and, you know, recognize, you know, finally that the battles that our ancestors, whether they were in the suffragist movement, whether in the civil rights movement or the labor movement, those are ongoing struggles. That's the most important thing I think that we can share today, is to realize that no advance, no social advance has ever been permanent, will ever be permanent. At one point, people thought Roe v. Wade was going to be permanent, right? Remember that, those days? Didn't happen, but not a cause for despair, but a reminder. Think about the generations of women who sacrificed up to that point, and let's keep faith with them and do what they would have done if they were still here today. Can you imagine going to someone like Frederick Douglass and saying, "Oh, Mr. Douglass, 2022 is so hard. I just can't wake up in the morning. It's just so hard." And or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or or Frances Perkins, during the Great Depression. Can you imagine going to Frances Perkins and saying, "Working conditions are so bad, Secretary Perkins, I'm just going to give up"? She'd be like, "What are you talking about?" Anyway, I know now I'm beginning to do a counterfactual thing. So it may be time for me to kind of wind up.
You have some final thoughts, Ron?
Well, we just all like to thank you, and you can sense that that's coming from everyone on the screen here. It's a thought-provoking, inspiring talk, and we hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron, for having me back. Thanks, everyone. Keep up the struggle. It's just such a pleasure and an honor to be with you and to be part of this community. Thank you.